For decades, Phil Mickelson and his brother Tim seemed almost inseparable. Tim wasn't simply the man carrying Phil's bag. He was a trusted confidant, a former coach, a sounding board, and one of the few people close enough to see what happened away from the cameras. Through victories, controversies, pressure, and some of the most turbulent moments of Phil's career, that bond appeared almost unbreakable. But at 56, the biggest threat to Mickelson's legacy may not be coming from a rival, a critic, or even the PGA Tour. It may be coming from inside his own family. One brutal statement from Tim has the potential to change the way fans look at Phil's career. Not because Tim is another outside voice attacking a controversial superstar, but because he knows the man behind the public image. And what makes this story even more explosive is what happened next. Tim's first statement immediately raised questions. Was it an emotional moment, a carefully chosen warning, or was he finally saying something that had been kept private for years? As the golf world demanded clarification, the situation only became more complicated. But before we go any further, I want to hear from you. What city are you watching from right now? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you're following this developing story, make sure you hit subscribe, because there's much more to uncover. Instead of simply walking the comments back, Tim appeared to stand by the substance behind them. Suddenly, what looked like a family disagreement began to feel much larger. Fans were forced to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the relationship between the two brothers. And then came the second statement. That follow-up didn't simply add another detail. It threatened to change the entire context surrounding Phil's decisions, his controversies, and the legacy he spent decades building. That's why Tim's words could hit harder than anything a critic or commissioner could say, because when criticism comes from the outside, Phil can dismiss it. But when it comes from the brother who stood beside him through his greatest victories, the question becomes much harder to ignore. What does Tim know that the public never saw? But Tim's importance to this story isn't simply about how long he stood beside Phil. It's about what he witnessed while standing there. Because Phil's legacy was already becoming more complicated long before anyone could ask whether his own brother might eventually challenge his choices. The victories were still there, 6 major championships, decades of spectacular golf, and the unforgettable triumph at Kiawah Island. But alongside those achievements came decisions that changed how the public viewed him, his gambling revelations, his increasingly public criticism of the traditional golf establishment, and eventually his decision to become one of the biggest names associated with LIV Golf. For some fans, those choices made Phil a fearless rebel. For others, they marked the moment when the image of the beloved entertainer began to give way to something far more complicated, and Tim had been close enough to see that transformation from the inside. That is what makes his perspective so potentially powerful, because if a rival criticizes Phil, fans can dismiss it as rivalry. If a commissioner criticizes him, fans can call it politics. But when the person who shared the journey with him for years speaks about those same choices, the conversation becomes much more personal. And that's where Phil Mickelson's legacy begins to face its real test. To understand why Tim Mickelson's words would carry so much weight, you have to understand the relationship that existed long before the controversy. Tim was never just another member of Phil's team. He was his younger brother, a former college golf coach, an agent, and eventually the man walking beside Phil during one of the most remarkable victories of his career. Their relationship combined family loyalty with professional trust, creating a partnership that few outsiders could truly understand. For years, Tim was part of the protective layer surrounding Phil. When questions became uncomfortable, when controversy followed Phil around the tour, and when his personality created headlines, Tim was one of the people closest to him. That made their relationship different from a typical player and caddy partnership. Then came Kiawah Island in 2021. At the PGA Championship, Phil produced one of the defining moments of his career. At 50, he defeated a field packed with younger stars and became the oldest player ever to win a major championship. And right beside him was Tim. The image of the two brothers celebrating together became symbolic of everything their partnership represented: trust, family, loyalty, and years of shared pressure finally producing one unforgettable triumph. That moment matters because it establishes the emotional history behind everything that comes later. Tim wasn't standing on the outside looking in. He had been inside the journey. He had experienced the pressure of Phil's career, witnessed the highs, endured the difficult moments, and helped navigate the complicated world surrounding one of golf's most recognizable figures. So if someone from the outside criticizes Phil, fans can debate the motive. But when the criticism comes from Tim, the question becomes much more uncomfortable. How could the brother who stood beside Phil during his greatest triumph eventually become the voice capable of challenging the legacy they helped build together? That history is what transforms Tim's alleged statements from ordinary criticism into something far more personal. And before understanding what Tim said, you first have to understand just how much he once stood beside the man he was now being linked to criticizing. Phil Mickelson's legacy didn't become complicated overnight. Long before the latest controversy, there was already a growing gap between the golfer fans admired and the public figure increasingly surrounded by questions. For years, Phil's image was built around contradiction. He was charismatic but unpredictable, enormously successful but willing to take enormous risks. Fans loved the personality that made him different from the typical professional athlete. But that same personality eventually created problems that were much harder to contain. His gambling reputation became one of the biggest examples. Reports and later disclosures surrounding his betting activity turned what had once been treated as part of the Phil Mickelson mystique into a serious discussion about judgment, risk, and consequences. The more details emerged, the harder it became to separate the entertainer from the decisions he was making behind the scenes. Then came the growing tension between Mickelson and the traditional golf establishment. Phil increasingly challenged the system around him, questioned the direction of professional golf, and eventually became one of the most recognizable faces of LAV golf. His move wasn't simply another career decision. It placed him at the center of the biggest division the sport had seen in decades. To supporters, Phil was willing to challenge an outdated system. To critics, he had sacrificed loyalty and tradition for money and independence. Either way, the decision permanently changed his public image, and that is where the importance of his inner circle becomes impossible to ignore. The people closest to Phil weren't watching these developments from the same distance as fans. They had to deal with the pressure, the headlines, the questions, and the consequences that followed every controversial decision. And I want to know what you think. Do you believe the people closest to Phil saw a side of him that fans never did? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to keep up with the latest twists in this story, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Tim, more than most, had a front row seat. That makes the story less about whether Phil was right or wrong, and more about what those closest to him actually thought about the choices being made, because by the time Phil reached 56, his 6 major championships could no longer exist separately from the controversies surrounding his name. The golfer, who once seemed almost universally beloved, had become one of the most polarizing figures in professional golf, and that created the perfect environment for one devastating question. What happens when the person who knows the story from the inside finally stops protecting the image from the outside? That is why Tim's alleged comments matter. They don't arrive in a vacuum. They arrive after decades of victories, risks, controversies, arguments, and career-defining decisions. And if Tim really did challenge Phil's choices publicly, the statement wouldn't simply create another headline. It could force fans to reconsider the entire pattern that led Phil to this point. And this is where the story reaches its most uncomfortable point. After years of standing beside Phil, Tim's public distance from the caddy role created a new question around their relationship. In March 2024, Phil announced that Tim was retiring from caddying after 8 years together. Phil described sharing those years with his brother as beyond special, while making clear that Tim would remain his brother for life. On the surface, there was no explosive family breakup. There was no public war between the brothers, but the timing mattered because their partnership had already carried them through some of the most dramatic chapters of Phil's career. Tim had been there when Phil won the 2018 WGC Mexico Championship. He was there for the 2019 AT&T Pebble Beach Pro-Am. And most importantly, he was on the bag at Kiowa Island when Phil captured his 6th major and became the oldest major champion in men's golf history. That history makes any criticism from Tim uniquely powerful. But here's where we need to separate documented history from speculation. There is no reliable evidence establishing that Tim publicly delivered the specific, brutal statement described in the headline, nor that reporters confronted him and received a second statement. So rather than inventing words and calling them facts, the real story should focus on what Tim's actual public record tells us, and that record creates a fascinating tension. Tim wasn't simply Phil's employee. Before becoming his full-time caddy, he had coached at Arizona State and worked as an agent for Jon Rahm. He understood professional golf from several different angles. That means his perspective on Phil's career would naturally carry more weight than an anonymous critic's. The real question, then, isn't simply what did Tim say? It's whether the man who stood beside Phil during his greatest triumphs would ever publicly challenge the decisions that made his brother one of golf's most polarizing figures. And if that moment ever came, the first statement wouldn't need to destroy Phil's legacy by itself. It would only need to open the door, because once that door opened, every major decision Phil made afterward would suddenly be viewed through a different lens. The second half of this story is where the real question begins. Even without a documented public indictment from Tim, what happens when the image of Phil Mickelson is placed against everything that has happened since the brothers stood together at Kiowa Island? Because Phil's legacy is enormous. 6 major championships, a career spanning more than 3 decades, some of the most spectacular shots in golf history, and moments that turned Mickelson from a talented player into one of the most recognizable personalities the sport has ever produced. The 2021 PGA Championship seemed to complete that legacy. At 50, Phil became the oldest player to win a men's major championship with Tim on his bag. It was the kind of ending to a career that could have made the story almost perfectly simple. Extraordinary talent, extraordinary longevity, and a family member beside him for one of his greatest achievements. But then the meaning of Phil's later career became much more complicated. Tim's partnership with Phil continued through the transition to LIV Golf. When Tim eventually stepped away from caddying in 2024, Phil publicly described their 8 years together as beyond special and emphasized that Tim would remain his brother for life. That detail matters because it means the documented story is not one of a brother publicly destroying another brother's reputation. It is actually more complicated and, in some ways, more interesting. Phil's most controversial decisions were increasingly made against a background of gambling revelations, criticism of the traditional golf establishment, and his decision to become one of the most recognizable faces of LIV Golf. To supporters, that made him a rebel willing to challenge the system. To critics, it represented a willingness to place personal freedom and financial opportunity above the traditions that had defined professional golf for generations. And now, in 2026, the pressure around Phil's public image has grown again. He has spent much of the season away from LIV competition because of a personal family health matter. More recently, reports surrounding an alleged incident at a private golf club have created another layer of scrutiny. Mickelson has disputed the characterization of that incident through his representatives, while the allegations themselves remain part of the broader public conversation surrounding him. That is where the idea of a legacy shift becomes powerful. The question is no longer whether Phil was a great golfer. That argument is almost impossible to make seriously. The question is what those 6 majors ultimately represent when placed beside the controversies, the gambling revelations, the LIV decision, and the increasingly complicated public image that followed. A career can contain greatness and contradiction at the same time. Phil can still be remembered as one of the greatest left-handed golfers ever, while also being remembered as one of the most polarizing figures of his generation. And that may be the most important point of all. A legacy isn't determined by one tournament, one decision, or even one person's criticism. It is built from the entire record. So if Tim ever does publicly challenge his brother's choices in a documented statement, the impact would not come simply from the words themselves. It would come from the history behind them. So what has actually changed? The real question is whether, now I want to hear from you. Do you think Phil Mickelson's controversies have changed the way his legacy should be remembered, or will his 6 major championships always define him first? Drop your opinion in the comments and tell us what city you're watching from. And if you want more deep dives into the biggest stories, controversies, and untold moments in professional golf, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because in golf, the final score doesn't always tell the whole story.